It is spectacularly disingenuous and cynical for Washington to point at Cuban suffering when Washington itself is responsible for it. We say, let Cuba breathe, let Cuba live. And we agree with the recent unanimously passed resolution of the Chicago City Council, which says, normalize relations with Cuba now. If you want to support the Cuban people, lift the embargo, end all sanctions, and allow free travel to and from Cuba. If Cuba was 1/10 as bad as Washington's propaganda says, they would pay you to go there. But instead, they block almost all travel. What are they afraid of us seeing? Cuba is the only country where workers and farmers run the government, which is why they have free universal health care. They have more doctors and teachers per capita than any country in the world. And it's why they run the world's largest medical school, which is of course free, to train doctors from some 67 countries, including the United States. And it's why they have provided what Nelson Mandela said was unique and invaluable assistance to African liberation. Again, we're here to say, let Cuba live, let Cuba breathe. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Eric Torres Alvarez, who is a Chicago filmmaker and a Cuban American. Eric?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. As Steve said, my name is Eric Torres Alvarez. That's EricTorres Alvarez. Yes, I am the son of Cubans, parents who came to the United States in 1961. I was raised all my life basically to believe the conservative line against Cuba, against the Cuban Revolution. And loving my parents as I do, of course I believe them, but I have developed my own beliefs since then. And I have to say that I have been to Cuba many times, and my grandfather lived through the worst of the problems that the United States, frankly, has imposed upon Cuba with this really inhumane blockade. My grandfather was an ardent supporter of the Cuban government, of the revolution, until the day he died. You know, even as hard as things were, I saw it with my own eyes many times. And so basically I want to say that I think that the blame should be placed, the blame for the problems that the Cuban people are suffering through should be pretty solidly placed where it belongs, which is the United States government and the blockade, which they like to call the embargo because that sounds nicer. But the blockade is what the Cubans call it for good reason, because it is a very fierce blockade. It's a real detriment to people's lives. You know, the things that Cuba is unable to do because of the policies of the U.S. government and the pressure the U.S. government has imposed on all other governments in the world. So it makes it very difficult for Cuba to live on their own terms and for people to make their own decisions in a healthy way. And so I'm just calling for an end to the blockade. This is the cause of the problems that people are reacting to right now. We can understand that people are hurting right now in Cuba for lack of medicine, lack of food, lack of electricity, you know, for fuel. This is why people are upset, and it's human nature for people to get upset about these things and to be confused and or rightfully questioning things. So I'm not against people, you know, protesting in Cuba, not at all. The Cuban government understands that this is what's happening, that people are confused, that they're angry for good reason, and sometimes people don't blame the right, you know, source, the right person, the right power for those problems, you know. And so I think us here in the United States, we're at a distance, we live here, we know what our government is capable of, both good and bad. And so we are asking and even demanding that the administration of Biden do the right thing and stop doing, you know, the same policies that, for example, Trump has enacted. Trump basically created a lot of the new restrictions against Cuba, and like a suit of clothes, and Biden is just wearing that suit. He just put it on and is just going on with it with what Trump did. So this to me is outrageous, and I just can't believe Biden is doing that. So I really feel strongly about this, as you can see, and I'm asking people to wake up and understand the real cause of these problems is here, United States, and we need to pressure our own government to not continue to do business as usual. So for the United States government to say, oh, let's give you some humanitarian aid, we're offering humanitarian aid to Cuba, that's like a landlord who's cut off your water saying, oh, you don't have any water, I'll bring you some bottled water, instead of fixing your plumbing, or letting you fix your plumbing, actually. That's what we're asking, is let Cuba do what it wants to do, let Cuba run its own affairs, as the people of Cuba have overwhelmingly voted to do, and the United States should stay out of it. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. Oh, okay. Okay. Ok, voy a hablar en español ahorita. Mi nombre es Eric Torres Álvarez, soy hijo de papás cubanos que salieron de Cuba en el año 61. Pues quisiera decir que tenemos un deber de hablar en contra del bloqueo americano, el bloqueo por parte de los Estados Unidos, que está impuesto en contra del gobierno cubano, porque el gobierno cubano es soberano. Y los problemas que la gente de Cuba, la gente que radica en Cuba están enfrentando, bueno, esos problemas están basados en la política de aquí, de los Estados Unidos. Este bloqueo es injusto, es inhumano. Y para decir que, bueno, estamos preocupados por la pobre gente de Cuba, lo que están sufriendo, eso es ingenuo, eso no tiene sentido eso, porque es como el dueño de un edificio ofreciendo de llevarte agua, botella, pomos de agua, cuando el agua no está fluyendo, cuando su tubería, con su plomería ya no sirve. En vez de dejarle reparar esa plomería, están ofreciendo botellas de agua para ayudarte. Entonces, eso es lo que está pasando ahorita con la política de los Estados Unidos, con lo que están diciendo. Estamos exigiendo de que el régimen, bueno, estoy llamándolo un régimen, bueno, el poder de Washington, del presidente Biden, estamos exigiendo que Biden cambie su política, porque está siguiendo la misma política que Trump. Es como si Trump hizo un traje y Biden puso el mismo traje. En vez de cambiar las injusticias, en vez de quitar el bloqueo, está inventando cosas, está jugando con Cuba. Entonces estamos exigiendo de que Cuba está dejado hacer sus cosas ellos mismos. La gente de Cuba merecen eso. Ellos merecen justicia. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Eric. Our next speaker is Corelia Drake, Cuban American and a leader of the Committee in Solidarity with Latin America, known as CESLA. Corelia?
Hi everyone. Voy a hablarles en español para los hispanohablantes sobre la importancia de esta protesta que no empezó hace 60 años, cuando el gobierno de este país impuso el criminal bloqueo que tiene a mi pueblo, al pueblo de Cuba, en dificultades de todo tipo, a pesar de los esfuerzos que hace nuestro gobierno, el gobierno que nosotros hemos decidido tener, que la mayoría de los cubanos decidieron tener por votación democrática. Cuando se dice democrática, significa que la mayoría de las personas estaban de acuerdo, como están de acuerdo en la ONU de tantos países. Pero el gobierno de este país no presta atención a eso, no le interesa lo que dice nadie. este país, pero no de los norteamericanos que viven aquí. Esa no es la voluntad del pueblo estadounidense. Lo conocemos, sabemos cómo sufren los negros, los latinos, hijos de latinos, porque no son blancos, son latinos, solamente son blancos los europeos. Ustedes no son blancos, ellos no los reconocen como blancos, pero ¿qué significa el color? ¿Dónde están los valores humanos? ¿Qué significa el color de la piel? ¿Qué significa? Nada significa. ¿Dónde están los valores humanos? No. Los valores materiales son los que priman en el capitalismo. Eso es lo que le interesa a este gobierno. Solamente eso, no hay conciencia. No hay amor. Queremos, pedimos, exigimos y reclamamos que se elimine el embargo o bloqueo, como lo quieran llamar. Todas esas medidas restrictivas no llevan a la paz, no llevan al acuerdo. El pueblo de Cuba sufre, sí, y está protestando, sí, porque hay que quitar el embargo, como ustedes lo llaman aquí. Me refiero al gobierno, no al pueblo estadounidense, que también está sufriendo miles de consecuencias de este sistema. Eliminen el embargo. Y el pueblo de Cuba tiene las bases humanas para desarrollarse. Gracias.
Our next speaker is Dr. Howard Airman, former Will County health commissioner during the Ebola leader of the people's response to COVID-19. Dr. Howard.
Voy a decir todo en español cuando termino en inglés. Good afternoon, my name is Dr. Howard Airman. I'm the former Assistant Commissioner of the Chicago Department of Public Health. I was the former Chief Medical Officer of Will County, and I worked at Cook County Hospital for over 30 years. I'm still on the faculty of the University of Illinois in Chicago. My wife is part Cuban. We've been to Cuba as part of the Chicago Cuba Coalition with the Venceremos Brigade for a number of decades. First, we want to congratulate in complete solidarity our sisters and brothers who won an incredibly significant strike of all county workers last night, 2,700 people who have stopped racist plantation politics. So what we're going to talk about now is the difference between the United States and Cuba. At this very moment, we have a president of the world's most powerful imperialist country who has continued the policies of Trump, trying to stranglehold the Cuban people by intercepting ships with vital fuel that's necessary not just for electricity, but to produce anything, including food, to produce energy for electricity, to do things that have to do directly with medicine. That is the Biden policy that he's continued. He has done everything that Trump does with a small exception. He is supporting directly through the US Congress the main think tank that's directing the counter-revolutionaries that's based by a Cuban in Mexico. This was a statement that's been verified by the Secretary of Foreign Relationships of the Republic of Cuba that is posted in the Washington Post yesterday. If you have not read that, you should read it, because all this is being directed out of that think tank, along with CIA operatives inside the country that are directly among the Cuban people who are leading the counter-revolutionaries, who are also inside many of the churches in Cuba every day stirring up problems. This is not to say that Cuba does not have significant problems. The problems that Cuba have are the most severe for 30 years since the special period. But the reason those problems are happening is because of the U.S. imperialist blockade. We are not saying that everybody who was on the street Sunday is a CIA operative. We are saying that the people who led it, that the people who organized it through social media are CIA operatives. And they are met by direct force by the revolutionaries in the street, and they will be continued to there. Our duty in the United States is to continue to put pressure against the U.S. imperialist government. I'm going to finish with talking about the difference between what Cuba has done to save millions of people from the pandemic and what the U.S. has done to foster the pandemic. Cuba has sent 34 health brigades to countries, one of whom is headed by Dr. Jose Aronte, who was the lead Cuban here in Chicago in 2017, working directly with the University of Illinois, our university, to save mothers and children from dying in Englewood. He is head of the one in Jamaica. Cuba has gone above and beyond board to 34 countries. It's now signed agreements with Venezuela, Iran, and soon with Mexico to not only ship them the Soberana vaccine, but to help them produce it in their own country. Okay, this is exactly the opposite of the Biden administration. The Biden administration say, let's waive the WTO intellectual property rights, and they've done almost nothing at all except to send a few million doses to other countries, but not help them produce the vaccine. This is the key thing. Countries are capable of producing the vaccine in the global south, yet only 2% of people are vaccinated. What's been the situation in the United States? Right at this moment, 150 million people in the United States do not have vaccine. They're vaccinated. They're disproportionately African American, Latino, and in some cases Native American. What has the Biden administration done? Appointed a CDC director who never worked 1 minute in public health, who has endangered the lives of millions of people by the May 13th guidance that says that it's okay for everybody who's vaccinated to go inside without a mask. The number one way to prevent this disease beside vaccine. Then on Friday, she issued another deadly guidance to schools saying that kids can go in school without masks if they're vaccinated. Who's going to know who's vaccinated and not? Cuba has done exactly the opposite. It has now vaccinated 1 out of 5 of their people. The Chicago Cuba Coalition is part of a national network that is getting millions of syringes to the island to vaccinate all 11 million people and then to help vaccinate people in the other countries. Voy a explicar en español. Mi nombre es Dr. Howard Airman. Soy un miembro de esta coalición de Cuba de Chicago. Fui el asistente comisionado del Departamento de Salud aquí en Chicago por el alcalde Mayor Harold Washington y otros alcaldes. Todavía soy un miembro de facultad en la Universidad de Illinois, Chicago. Estoy representando este grupo, los vecinos de mi villita en la villita, y tengo más de 50 años de experiencia en salud pública. El origen de este problema es con el gobierno imperialista de los Estados Unidos, dirigido por presidente Biden, que sigue con todas las leyes, con todas las reglas del presidente Trump, para oprimir el pueblo de Cuba, los 11 millones de gente valiente que ya fueron a 34 países con brigadas de médicos, con brigadas de enfermeras, y ya firmaron contratos con Irán, contratos con Venezuela, y va a firmar un contrato este mes con México para producir la vacuna que funciona completamente bien, que produció un país de 11 millones de habitantes. Este presidente está bloqueando por el bloqueo que petróleo puede llegar a las puertas de Cuba. Esto está afectando la electricidad, está afectando toda la producción de comida, de medicinas. Esto es para matar el pueblo de Cuba. Pero el pueblo de Cuba responde. El pueblo de Cuba está fuerte. Y el origen de todo esto son fondos de congresistas de Estados Unidos y este gobierno que crearon una organización adentro de la República Mexicana, dirigiendo por un gusano cubano que está organizando todas estas demostraciones. No estamos diciendo que toda la gente en la calle o la mayoría son agentes de CIA. Estamos diciendo que estos dirigentes son agentes de CIA, que CIA está adentro, muchas iglesias en Cuba, está haciendo muchos problemas para el pueblo, pero el pueblo, la mayoría, está unidos y nunca va a rendir, nunca va a hincar a frente de los imperialistas, abajo con el bloqueo.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Airman. Our final speaker will be John Hawkins, a leading activist with the Chicago Cuba Coalition and a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. John?
I want to thank you all for inviting me to speak today. President Joseph Biden's remarks in response to Sunday's demonstrations in Cuba come as no surprise. His support for those seeking to overturn the Cuban government, a government supported by the overwhelming majority of the Cuban people, has been obvious from day one of his administration. In May, Biden's administration announced that it was renewing Cuba's placement on the list of governments it claims aren't, quote, cooperating fully, unquote, with U.S. anti-terrorism efforts. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez called the charge false and slanderous, noting that the new Democratic Party administration has maintained all 243 measures imposed by the Donald Trump White House aimed at increasing the squeeze on Cuba. Every president of the United States, Democrat and Republican alike, has enforced U.S. imperialism sanctions against Cuba. They began being imposed not long after Cuba's workers and farmers, led by Fidel Castro and the July 26 movement, overthrew Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship in 1959, a dictatorship that was backed by the United States government. The sanctions against Cuba are aimed at one thing only, at punishing the Cuban people for replacing capitalist exploitation and oppression with a revolutionary workers and farmers government. They are aimed at punishing the Cuban people for carrying out the only meaningful land reform in this hemisphere. They're aimed at punishing the Cuban people for taking the greatest strides taken in any country in the world toward uprooting race and sex discrimination. They're aimed at punishing the Cuban people for making access to housing, education and health care a right of every resident of Cuba, not just citizens, every resident of Cuba. They're aimed most of all at the social solidarity the Cuban workers and farmers have built and organized over decades on that island. This is a social solidarity that they've shown in action for decades, and it extends to workers and farmers around the world. They've shown it, as others have already mentioned, through their medical volunteers who have served and continue to serve in dozens of countries around the world. They've shown it also through their voluntary military missions to aid workers and farmers and struggle against imperialist domination. The most notable of these, Cuba's more than a decade-long military mission in Angola, helped the Angolan people defeat the South African attempt to undermine their country's sovereignty and independence, and in the process won the independence of Namibia and laid the groundwork for the rapid downfall of the apartheid regime in South Africa itself. Yesterday, Mexico's president hit the nail on the head when he told the press, the truth is that if one wanted to help Cuba, the first thing that should be done is to suspend the blockade of Cuba, as a majority of countries in the world are asking. The Socialist Workers' Party has worked toward that end for 6 decades, and we will continue to work with others to demand an end to the embargo, an end to the economic war against Cuba, the withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Guantanamo, and the normalization of diplomatic relations with Cuba. We say U.S. hands off Cuba.
Right on, John. Thank you very much. We actually do have an additional speaker that we're pleased to introduce. Rafael Cervantes is with the aforementioned coalition in solidarity with Latin America, CESLA. Rafael?
Buenos días, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Rafael Cervantes, Rafael Cervantes, and I represent a group in Chicago called CESLA, Coalición en Chicago en solidaridad con Latinoamérica. Estamos aquí para decir basta del bloqueo, alto al bloqueo. Eso es lo principal en este momento. Hemos visto en toda Latinoamérica, en México, el apoyo que el pueblo de Latinoamérica está dando al pueblo de Cuba. No nada más presidentes como el de México, sino también la gente en la calle está apoyando. El gobierno de Estados Unidos debe convencerse de una vez por todas que el bloqueo es algo que está reprobado por todos los países del mundo, excepto 2 o 3 títeres en la última votación en las Naciones Unidas. El bloqueo debe terminar, punto. Blockade has to stop. Not only presidents of Latin America, but the entire, a large part of the Latin American population is in support of the people of Cuba and is against the blockade, is against el bloqueo. So the government of the United States has to stop it, and there were only 2 countries voting to continue when the last voting was in the United Nations. So we are here to say that Latin America is not only in support of Cuba, but also, and this is what the United States fears, for the Latin American people, Cuba is an example. It's a shining example like that light over there. It's a shining example that the United States can't resist, the government of the United States, because we've seen that they produce a vaccine. We've seen that their educational system is superior of all of the other Latin American educational systems, and even the United States also. So it is a shining light, and that's what the United States is afraid. That's why they haven't, for 60 years, they have strangled that small island of Latin America. They are our brothers and sisters, and we are going to support them all the way. Thank you.
No, not. All right, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate the speakers, and we are here again to say, Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Bloqueo no. Thank you.
Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no.
Thank you.